Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old 4th Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
By now, you are aware of the deadly plane crash over the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. And by now, you're aware that this, like anything else in this political climate, has become something of a tug of war and a blame game scenario. Let's start with audio from Fox 11 Los Angeles.
New information this hour about the mid-air collision between a passenger plane and an Army helicopter. An FAA preliminary report reveals one air traffic controller was working two positions at the time of the crash. The plane carried 64 passengers and crew, while 3 soldiers were on the chopper.
By the way, one of those troops from Gwinnett County here in Metro Atlanta.
At least 28 bodies have been recovered. Also, the airplane's black boxes. The National Transportation Safety Board is investigating. President Trump sparking outrage today by linking the air disaster to the federal diversity hiring programs.
With zero evidence, by the way. We'll go into that in just a minute.
I changed the Obama standards from very mediocre at best to extraordinary. You remember that. Only the highest aptitude, they have to be the highest intellect and psychologically superior people were allowed to qualify for air traffic controllers.
Hours later, President Trump signed an order reviewing all federal aviation hiring and safety decisions.
Joining us now to discuss all of this is Jody Armour, a law professor at the University of Southern California. Good to have you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
What makes the president's remarks today controversial?
Well, the controversy is the connection between D.E.I, someone from an underrepresented group or a woman, and the claim that they are not excellent. They are underqualified or unqualified.
Yes.
And the belief, without any evidence, without any receipts,
none, that
for one thing, it was a controller that was the cause of the accident rather than someone in the helicopter. So before we've even figured out who the cause is,
right,
if you're going to blame a DEI in the air traffic controller department, how can they be to blame if the accident was caused by the helicopter? So we're leaping ahead of the story to go into some other kind of narrative that may not be even relevant.
But that's what this guy does. And honestly, that's what punditry tends to do as well. But I have to tell you, I follow this stuff as much as I possibly can. I keep my eyes on it socially. I check the dial. I even scan through the cable news outlets. No one leapt to... Well, here's what's funny. I was text messaging with my friend Daryl yesterday. He is under the weather, been dealing with, he found out he's got COVID, and we were just texting back and forth, and Daryl used to serve in the Air Force. So anything military or flight related or Air Force, it comes up in conversation. And I mean, minutes before the Donald Trump press conference, I just kind of half jokingly said, if one member of the Army flight crew or the American Airlines crew or air traffic control isn't white, straight male, the DEI howls will commence. If they're all white, straight males, nothing. And then Donald Trump went on to give a statement yesterday before the media and lurched right into DEI. Let's go back to Fox 11 Los Angeles with USC professor Jody Armour.
So we are new into this second presidency of President Trump. People knew what they were voting for. They knew that. They know that. He held this news conference at first starting out with a moment of silence for those who've lost their lives. The recovery efforts were still going on. What do you make of the timing of the president to then talk political issues?
Yeah, that was very presidential, unifying, to stand there and have us take that moment of silence and think about how these country folk of ours, are no longer with us. And to go from that moment of unity, of solidarity, of bringing us nationally together to something, one of the most divisive kinds of issues without any evidence that, again, the DEI was even involved in this, because we don't know that a controller was at the cause of it. So to introduce something so polarizing right after the call for unity was incongruous.
Well, the man can't help himself. He has to do that. He has to be divisive. And he also has to deflect. And we'll dive into why he's deflecting in just a few minutes. But first, let's go back to this conversation, because I think it's important to point out, remember, first Trump term, there were guardrails. You had some establishment folks who were alongside him who were not afraid to speak contrary or to at least sort of ham-hand and walk back anything that he'd said. Now, the guardrails are gone.
Well, you had the vice president also speak on that matter as well, and also Hegseth also spoke, so he had his administration backing him up. Let's listen into that.
When you don't have the best standards in who you're hiring, it means on the one hand, you're not getting the best people in government, but on the other hand, it puts stresses on the people who are already there. And I think that is a core part of what President Trump is going to bring and has already brought to Washington, D.C. is we want to hire the best people because we want the best people at air traffic control.
You know, here's the thing about any government job to begin with. First of all, any of us who have had to go to, say, I don't know, the DMV, we know that that's a beating. It's not fun. You're waiting long lines. It seems that those folks are understaffed and they may be well qualified, but they're not ready for your I mean, they're just not ready for your attitude. They're going to be very matter of fact. They don't want to play around. They don't want to goof around and joke around. They're overwhelmed with work and understaffed, right? They're also, by and large, this is very general, underpaid. Let me give you the AI overview of this. Federal employees, by the way, typically earn less than private sector employees with similar jobs. There is a big pay gap. In 2024, federal employees received a 5.2% raise. That was the largest in 43 years. Thank you, Joe Biden. However, federal salaries were still 24.72% lower than private sector jobs. The Federal Employee Pay Comparability Act was passed in 1990 to reduce the pay gap, but it has not been fully implemented. That's limited government, y'all. That's what you want. Limited government, you get limited government. Remember which administration rolled in with DOGE, right? I mean, they've been trying to cut costs, and there was the federal buyout program. I mean, how do we know that somebody in air traffic control that was supposed to be on the shift at Reagan that night didn't take the buyout? We don't know that, but we're not going to leap to that conclusion right away.
So what do you make of the stance the president and team are trying to take on this very day?
Yeah. If I actually believe that unqualified people, because of a program like D.E.I. or any other program, were getting in positions that they weren't ready for, I would be outraged too. We all should be outraged. The question is, are unqualified people coming in through that gateway? Right. And I talk to a lot of managers. They say, we start with excellence. Unless you cross a threshold of excellence, we don't even consider you. Once you cross that threshold of excellence, we may consider factors like maybe from the southeast of the country, and we're trying to get that perspective because we're dealing with people from there. But if you haven't crossed the threshold of excellence, you're not in the conversation. That's what good DEI is supposed to be, not just automatically allowing unqualified people. I would be outraged too, so we got to get clear on what we mean by DEI.
So do you agree or disagree then what you just heard from the vice president about hiring the best people?
Yeah, there's no contradiction between excellence and diversity, between excellence and having a woman on the job or a minority on the job. They can be excellent, no reason to assume they're not.
But we were just going over this yesterday, actually. Remember Representative Nancy Mace, the anti-trans congresswoman from South Carolina, was quick to go on the Twitter X platform and brag about how she was the first female graduate from the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. I mean, congratulations. It's, I remember when it was monumental that a woman was even being allowed in the Citadel. She's the first to graduate from the Citadel. And then, of course, those on the right, including the likes of Matt Walsh, were sitting there roasting her because she was admitting that she was a DEI candidate. Oops. I mean, I could bring up the fact that her father was like the brigadier general at the place too, and I'm not going to mention nepotism, but I mean, so do we start questioning her qualifications or no?
As we're going forward in a brand new year here, brand new presidency, overall, what are you seeing with this president that Americans can expect for this term?
Well, this was a day of unity, a kind of going both ways. Some positive, calling for unity, and then something very divisive. So there'll probably be moments of grace and moments of turmoil like this.
Politically speaking, what's the strategy behind this?
Well, this is one of the issues that he ran on, that, underrepresented groups are trying trying to get into these positions and they don't have the qualifications, and I'm going to end that. So the real question always is, and debate should be, do they have the qualifications? Unqualified people should not be getting in these positions. He's right. Are these programs letting unqualified people in? Not the ones I've been connected with, but if there are some, root them out.
Right.
Well, you had the former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg really take issue with the president's words. All right, Jody Armour, USC professor, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you for being here.
Again, that conversation on Fox 11 Los Angeles, I'll include it in the show notes at ronshowatl.com. Yes, Pete Buttigieg did have something to say. He tweets, despicable. As families grieve, Trump should be leading, not lying. We put safety first, drove down close calls, grew air traffic control, and had zero commercial airline crash fatalities out of millions of flights on our watch. President Trump now oversees the military and the FAA. One of his first acts was to fire and suspend some of the key personnel who helped keep our skies safe. Time for the president to show actual leadership and explain what he will do to prevent this from happening again. From the New Republic, Hafiz Rashid reporting. Last week, just days after his inauguration, Donald Trump eliminated the membership of a key committee that handles aviation security, and on Wednesday night, a passenger plane collided with a military helicopter in the Washington, D.C. area. On Tuesday, January 22nd, the Aviation Security Advisory Committee's members received a memo from the Trump administration saying that the Department of Homeland Security was getting rid of the membership of all advisory committees in a, quote, commitment to eliminating the misuse of resources and ensuring that DHS activities prioritize our national security. At the same time, Trump also fired the heads of the Transportation Security Administration and the Coast Guard. That's why he went before the media yesterday to discuss anything but any culpability on his part. With Harry Truman, he said the buck stops here. With Donald Trump, well, what about D.E.I. and the last administration? It's always somebody else. More from the New Republic. Congress mandated the Aviation Committee in 1988 after the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing over Lockerbie, Scotland. After Trump's move, the committee technically continues to exist but has no members to examine safety issues in airlines and airports. Its membership consisted of key groups in the aviation industry, from the major unions to representatives from major airlines, as well as a group associated with victims of the Pan Am bombing. Throughout its existence, the committee's recommendations were adopted into air travel procedure. It was out of commission for more than a week until Wednesday's disaster. God bless Jessica Tarloff, by the way, on The Five on Fox News. Here's what she had to say in the midst of the aftermath of the Trump DEI bombshell at his press briefing.
I echo everyone's sentiments about how heart-wrenching this is for the families of those who passed away. It's going to be a very long road. There was a story about a figure skater who was part of this group who tried to get on the plane, but his dog was too big. Right. So he had to make the 14-hour drive, which saved his life. And I'm sure his survivor's guilt, knowing how close that community is going to be terrible. A lifetime of pain and anguish. And it's just heartbreaking. The staffing issue, obviously a massive problem. If you have one person doing two people's jobs in the dark, with the way those runways are, with the lights of a city, which I know is a complicating factor as well, even if they did have night vision goggles, which we have heard that they did have them on board the Black Hawk. In terms of what the president has said, and I fully appreciate, as Greg has said many times now, it doesn't matter if you like how he says it or what he says. This is what people voted for. And I agree with you to a large degree. People said, I have a problem with DEI, for instance. I don't care about it being gruff. I want to see the action. But I would say that there is a moment to be talking about those things, and there is a moment to just be a consoler in chief. I thought that CNN's aviation expert, Pete Montine, put it well. He said what he said is not only unprofessional, unpresidential, inconsiderate of the status of the investigation, but it's frankly unhinged. This DEI policy was put into...
You agree that was unhinged, what he did?
I think coming out, and the first part when he was reading off the prompter was correct. Whoever wrote it, if it was Stephen Miller or someone else, that sounded like somebody who was actually thinking of the families of the people who had just passed away. And then he had a campaign rally in the middle of what should have been a somber occasion.
Yes.
And these DEI policies were put in place in 2013. He had every opportunity through his first administration to revoke them if they thought they were terrible, but he didn't. And when you talk about staffing issues, sure, the control room is a problem, but you know what else is a problem? That there's no head of the FAA because Michael Whitaker resigned for months. Elon Musk has been trying to push him out since September when he said you should pay a $600,000 fine for SpaceX that they're failing to follow the license requirements. Constantly on him. He knows he's going to get fired. He resigns. We have no head of the Coast Guard, and they have in the first week in office gutted this key aviation safety advisory committee.
Coast Guard.
I'm talking about all the people that take care of us, that make sure that you are safe. They are trying to gut that to install people.
Biden was taking care of us? Biden couldn't even show up in Palestine for a year.
That's my favorite game that you play. It's not going to work for
Go ahead.
Really? I'm talking about the president. You won. And now I'm talking about the president and the people he put into office. He showed up with one message. It's DEI's fault. Then Hegseth says DEI. Then Duffy says DEI. And then J.D. Vance, maybe playing a little bit of cleanup, says, well, if it wasn't DEI in terms of the pilots it's very stressful to work with people when we have these kinds of DEI policies. DEI is not a scapegoat for everything. It is, I get it, for some voters, it's what they want to hear about. But
in a way, DEI is the mirror to the Democrats' argument with racism or climate change. It can be used to explain everything.
Here's where I will turn this around on Greg Gutfeld or anybody else who wants to question diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of a hiring practice, whether at federal level, state level, corporate level. It's time to turn DEI around to vex these wingnuts' illogical fallacy. White men are only 31% of the U.S. population. If the American Airlines flight crew, the military helicopter flight crew, and the Reagan air traffic control staffing at that point in time is more than 31% white, at what point do we need to start asking if H.I.E, that would be homogeny, inequality, and exclusion. Let's just start using that term, H.I.E. At what point do we need to ask if H.I.E, hiring the white guy, played a role? It's a question we never ask. We never ask that. And maybe it's time to start doing that. Or maybe it just sounds sort of trivial and churlish, especially in the immediate aftermath of such a disaster. Back to Greg Gutfeld.
And it's not our fault to wonder, is this playing a role in a lot of the problems that we were seeing in whether it was airplane parts or anything, or in the entertainment industry? We saw problems and we're going like, well, this seems to be everywhere. We were told that. So I think the suspicion is fair. It may not be right. This could have been human error. This could have been a malfunction. But the suspicion is always going to be there because it was placed there by your clan.
That is just a fancy way for a white guy to admit that he's a racist. Thank you for listening. If you're doing so on America One Radio, 9 a.m. or 5 p.m., we do a replay at 11 p.m. on Progressive Voices via TuneIn. The show is also available via podcast, just about wherever you podcast. iHeart, Apple, Odyssey, let's see where else, Pandora, YouTube, podcast. We're all over the podcast spectrum, and I appreciate you listening. You can get the show notes, just about anything you hear me read from or audio from, you get that at ronshowatl.com. Speaking of audio, how about this from 2005? This is a gem.
Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job.
Yeah, I remember Brownie doing a heck of a job, the head of FEMA, the guy who was like a show horse association president or chairperson or whatever. Like he had no qualification whatsoever. And then suddenly he is the head of the Federal Emergency Management Association, FEMA. It's like the turtle atop the fence post. What's he doing there? Doesn't belong there. How'd he get there? Was it DEI? It wasn't DEI. We have to talk about how we societally view just going to a fast food restaurant, for example. It's so easy to be dismissive of the work being done behind the counter. And I am as guilty of it as anybody. But when you don't pay people well and they don't get good benefits or benefits at all, I mean, are they really driven to succeed? Are they motivated? Does their paycheck reward them for a job well done? We find ourselves making quips about folks who are making squat pay working jobs that we don't want to do. I mean, look at the agriculture industry right now. You don't see a whole lot of white folks out there picking fruits and vegetables, working in food processing plants. No, we want to demonize those folks. Actually, we want to deport them. And then somehow magically food prices are going to go down, right? Government jobs in a lot of, again, you heard me read just earlier how when factored into comparing them to private sector jobs of the same type, they make about 75% of the pay that they should be making. That's that limited government. I mean, we've been limiting government now for more than 4 decades, and little money in, little result out. And again, I'm not blaming air traffic control. We don't know. We don't know how this investigation is going to turn out. We don't know that this wasn't a mistake of the airline's flight crew, 2 males, by the way, flying that plane, or the Army helicopter. Let's go to NBC News and Lester Holt.
Pentagon correspondent Courtney Cubey joins us. Courtney, what are you finding out from your sources?
Well, Lester, the Black Hawk crew included 3 U.S. soldiers from Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Okay. Army officials calling them a very experienced crew, including an instructor pilot with over 1,000 flight hours. This was a routine annual evaluation of the pilot's ability to fly at night, the crew well aware of the route and the rules in this airspace. Now, while the military has not yet identified the crew, officials say one of the members was a woman.
Uh-oh. Nobody tell Nancy Mace that it was a woman. But was it a trans woman or was it a woman?
Broadcasting 5 days a week to make common sense common again. This is The Ron Show on America One Radio.
You know, I don't know if there's correlation. No, I think there is correlation to this. I'm going to read to you an article that I found at them.us. I actually found the leaked memo as well that just is leading credence to this. Here's the headline. Leaked memo suggests a top U.S. agency will no longer recognize Pride, MLK Day, and Holocaust remembrance. This is Samantha Rydell, who writes that the alleged Defense Intelligence Agency document falls in line with Trump's targeting of marginalized people in the federal government. Here's the story. The U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, D.I.A., is reportedly canceling all future LGBTQ plus Pride observances, along with a host of other significant events for marginalized communities, according to a leaked internal memo obtained by independent journalist Ken Klippenstein. There was an update on this story, by the way, later in the day that said, in response to a request for comment, a spokesperson for the Defense Intelligence Agency told them.us that the DIA is, quote, working with the Department of Defense to fully implement all executive orders and administration guidance in a timely manner. So they didn't deny this. Back to the them.us piece. I'll have it in the show notes, RonShowATL.com. Klippenstein, a former reporter for The Intercept and sometime Twitter prankster, posted the memo on social media Wednesday claiming that an intelligence official had leaked a photo of it directly to him. Yeah, I've seen this too, by the way. According to the document, which appears to have been stamped January 28th and bears a letterhead with DIA and Department of Defense seals, the agency is putting an indefinite, quote, pause on at least 11 special observances, air quotes, scheduled annually between January and November. That list includes the entirety of Pride Month, federally observed in June since 1999. Other canceled observances include Black History Month in February, Women's History Month in March, Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month in May, and Juneteenth on June 19th, which is a federal holiday. Women's Equality Day on August 26th, National Hispanic Heritage Month, and Disability Employment Awareness Month in October, and National American Indian Heritage Month in November are also canceled, as well as Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, that is a federal holiday, and Holocaust Remembrance Days, according to the leaked memo. Them attempted to contact the DIA's Public Affairs Office to confirm the leaked memo's authenticity, but did not receive a reply at the time of writing. Remember, I just read to you the update that said that they had no comment, aside from implementing the Trump executive orders and memorandums, blah, 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 blah. The department forms the intelligence wing of the Department of Defense and is the, quote, primary manager and producer of foreign military intelligence in the U.S. government, according to its website. The letter reads, the DIA will pause all activities and events related to special emphasis programs effective immediately and until further notice. Special emphasis programs are employment programs within the federal government that, as the name implies, place special emphasis on marginalized communities like people of color, disabled people, and LGBTQ plus citizens. The DIA will also be pausing agency resource groups, affinity groups, and employee networking groups effective immediately upon issuance of the memo. More from them. The leaked memo references having received, quote, questions about across the workforce in relation to two of President Trump's executive orders issued on January 20th, which rescinded numerous Biden-era executive orders and instructed federal agencies to dismantle all diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI programs. Trump's anti-DEI order quickly sent shockwaves throughout the federal government. I don't know why. They've had months to prepare for this kind of insanity. Shockwaves throughout the government, particularly after the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, reportedly directed workers to snitch on alleged efforts to mask various DEI offices and programs from the purge. That directive also contained a template memo for agency heads to send to their departments, warning of unspecified, quote, adverse consequences, intimidation, for those who fail to report their colleagues, several examples of which were themselves leaked to Ken Klippenstein within hours. Trump's anti-DEI order was also part of the justification for a directive from the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, this week, which issued a memo declaring a freeze on federal funding for numerous programs until they were found to comply with Trump's agenda, which is, of course, to root out DEI. That memo caused widespread confusion and outrage before it was abruptly rescinded on Wednesday afternoon, but White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt also asserted that only the memo itself was withdrawn, not the ordered freeze on funds, leaving the situation as yet uncertain. Then there's this one. How about this new headline? Sanjana Karanth reports that a new Department of Transportation memo directing funds to communities with, quote, higher marriage and birth rates. Tripping in racism a little bit, I guess. The Department of Transportation has released a memo ordering that programs supported or assisted by the agency prioritize funding projects for communities that have above average marriage and birth rates. You can't make this stuff up, y'all. Newly confirmed Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy buried the oddly specific requirement by describing the Wednesday memo as focused on economic growth. Well, yeah, it's for communities with higher marriage and birth rates, rather than population growth, and echoed President Donald Trump's criticism of programs to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion. The American people deserve an efficient, safe, and pro-growth transportation system based on sound decision-making, not political ideologies, Duffy said. Duffy, white male, former Real World contestant, performer, whatever, on MTV. Of the memo, which was signed just hours before a military helicopter crashed into a passenger plane near Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, killing everyone on both aircraft and sending Duffy and other transportation officials scrambling. According to the memo, programs and activities supported by the Transportation Department should prioritize projects that improve transportation for families with young children and give preference to communities with marriage and birth rates higher than the national average. This memo applies to DOT and DOT-supported grants, loans, and contracts, including existing agreements. A spokesperson for the DOT did not immediately respond to the Huffington Post request for comment. Continuing here, states with both marriage and birth rates higher than the national average include Utah and South Dakota, according to 2022 data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. In those predominantly white states, cultural or religious norms may encourage marriage and family building. In addition to the language around marriage and birth rates, the memo also blocks recipients of DOT funding from implementing, quote, mask mandates. Oh my God. A reference to requirements transit agencies follow to limit the spread of infection during the height of COVID-19. The memo also requires recipients to comply with federal immigration enforcement in order to receive funding. The latest effort by the administration to target undocumented immigrants, conduct mass arrests and deportations, and deny federal transportation funds to so-called sanctuary cities. Sounds to me like money that may have prior been earmarked from prior legislation. I mean, we did have a huge infrastructure investment law passed under the Biden administration, right? It sounds to me like there's going to be a good bit of diversion of money desperately needed for America's large major cities is instead going to go to the suburbs and Utah and South Dakota. If you were hoping for, I don't know, high-speed rail enhancements or programs to launch, if you were in a major city hoping to see your mass transit authority get beefed up, hello, Atlanta, looking at you. New stops, in-city, infill stations, some exfill stations, pie in the sky, thoughts of maybe MARTA reaching Gwinnett County, Cobb County, Well, we'll have to check the birth rates and the marriage rates of those two counties, I guess. But as long as MARTA is only contained to Fulton and DeKalb County and the city of Atlanta, well, sorry, guys. If we don't have high enough marriage and birth rates, and by the way, does that also impact, it sounds to me like it would, right? It would impact any major city with higher than normal LGBTQ plus population because they're not giving birth, not all that often anyway. And do their births count when they're using surrogacy? I mean, there's a lot of questions to be asked here from this goofy little weird, oddly specific anti-DEI memo with regard to transportation. And remember, again, the infrastructure law passed under Joe Biden has many more years of implementation and funds and grants and loans attached to it. So you can expect to see America's major cities now suffer from not having the funding that they were once promised under that law. Any plans that they had put in place as a result of that law are now going to be sabotaged in some respects from this oddly specific anti-DEI, pro-marriage and birth rate memo that came out just earlier this week. I'm telling you, we've got to figure out the use of this term, H.I.E, homogeny, inequality, exclusion, because that's exactly what the Trump administration is implementing. I wouldn't just say anti-DEI. I would say pro-H.I.E, homogeny, inequality, exclusion. That is the hallmark of this incoming Trump presidency, just now a week and a half into effect. So I know folks on the left of center are hand-wringing the next 4 years is going to be tough. The next 2 years is going to be tough. Yes, no doubt about it. But how popular is this stuff? We're getting some tea leaves. These are the final few moments of the Ron Show for today and for the work week. There is a weekend edition, by the way, that'll air, I believe, 10 a.m. Saturday and Sunday at Progressive Voices via TuneIn. If you're listening now, great. America One Radio, is it? 9 a.m., 5 p.m., Progressive Voices, 11 p.m. Show's also available via podcast. We're all over the social media sphere, at Ron Show ETL, Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, X, Threads. Sky News out of Australia, owned by News Corp, Rupert Murdoch. Let this YouTube video out here how long ago was this? Let me play the audio first.
This is a very different Donald Trump. He's leading a very different administration, the way he's attacking things, and the American public is very much more in line with him than they were at any point during his entire first term.
Well, I would say, correction, this is not a very different Donald Trump. This is a very different Donald Trump as being viewed by voters in this.
In the way he's going about things with Susan Wiles leading things, I think he is, going at things in a much less disorganized fashion, much more organized.
Take me back in history.
Take you back in history. So it was so interesting to me that Donald Trump's first net approval rating of his second term is higher than his entire first term. And I was interested, has that ever happened? Has the second term net approval rating in the first month, have you ever had a higher rating than any net approval rating during the entire first term? Donald Trump is the only...
I have a hard time believing this.
This is 100% true. I went back. I love spreadsheets. Donald Trump's is the first guy ever whose net approval rating in the first month of his second term is higher than any rating that he had as an entire first term, Kate Baldwin. This is true. I don't make stuff up. The numbers are the numbers.
Okay, and then Sky News goes on to give us these quotes. U.S. President Donald Trump's approval rating has hit a record high only days after being sworn into office. On CNN, senior political data reporter Harry Ensign stated Americans are already liking what they're seeing from Trump. A poll by Reuters Ipsos illustrated that Trump ended his first week as president with his highest approval rating ever. His highest approval rating ever. 8 years ago, the newly elected president had a negative rating of 3 points, a far cry from his rating now. Ensign commented the rating is up 9 points before noting that 47% of Americans approve of Trump compared to 41% who do not. Yeah, it's about that, actually. New Gallup poll came out. This published on the 29th. Trump's inaugural approval rating is historically low again. Americans are divided over whether Trump's pace in addressing major U.S. problems is about right or too fast, or maybe just wrong. At 47%, President Donald Trump's initial job approval rating for his second term is similar to the inaugural 45% reading during his first term, again placing him below all other elected presidents dating back to 1953. Trump remains the only elected president with sub 50% initial approval ratings, and his latest disapproval rating of 48% is 3 percentage points higher than in 2017, marking a new high for inaugural ratings. I'll have this in the show notes at RonShowATL.com. Trump's current job approval rating from Gallup's January 21 through 27 poll is not significantly different from the 51% readings earned by George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan in the early days of their presidencies. However, initial evaluations of Trump differ in that Americans are much more likely to disapprove of his performance rather than have no opinion, as was the case for the elder Bush and Reagan. John Kennedy had the highest inaugural approval rating at 72%, followed closely by Dwight Eisenhower and Barack Obama, who both had strong starts with 68% readings. Jimmy Carter received 66% approval rating, while Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton, and Joe Biden and George W. Bush had ratings between 57 and 59%. Although Trump's latest rating is weak, compared with past presidents' initial readings, it is among the best he has received as president. Hi, Sky News. Thanks for editing. He has received as president. His personal high point during his first term, well, that's cute, 49%, which he earned on several occasions in 2020, prior to COVID. Trump averaged 41% approval in his first term and is the only president not to receive a job rating of 50% or higher at any point in his presidency. He left office in January 2021 with the lowest rating of his presidency, 34%, after the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, which Americans seem to have forgotten. As was the case during his first term, Gallup writes, Trump's current job rating is sharply polarized, with 91% of Republicans approving, compared with just 6% of Democrats and 46% of independents. Underwater with independents. This 85-point gap between Republicans and Democrats is similar to the average 81% gap throughout his first term. It is also close to Biden's 87-point gap at the beginning of his term in 2021. At the start of Trump's first term, partisans' approval ratings were separated by 76 points, 90% Republicans, 14% Democrats, whereas prior to that, the gaps in partisans' initial approval ratings of new presidents ranged from 24 to 56 points. Reading on here, Trump began his second presidential term by signing a record number of executive actions. Remember when Republicans hated executive actions? Oh, they hated it when Obama did it. Oh, they kept pace on the number. Oh, it's a record number. Targeting a wide range of policy areas, including immigration, defense, and the military, foreign policy, the environment, and government efficiency. The poll was completed before the Trump administration initiated a pause on trillions of dollars of grants, loans, and other federal financial assistance, which was later temporarily blocked by a federal judge and then rescinded by Trump. Obviously, this poll also came out before he leapt to the dais yesterday and blamed D.E.I. for a plane crash that he has absolutely no clue about the staffing for the plane, the helicopter, air traffic control tower. Not saying that that'll have an impact, but it can't help. I mean, he goes the divisive route. He had the chance to unite the country. You heard the USC professor talk about that at the top of the show. Had a chance to unite the country. Started out doing very well and then went right into DEI. He just can't help himself. Back to the Gallup story here. At the time of the poll, Americans were divided in their views of Trump's pace in addressing the major problems facing the country today, with 40% saying it is, quote, about right, 37% saying it is too fast, and 14% saying not fast enough. The broad majority of Republicans, 83%, think his pace is about right, while 61% of Democrats think he's moving too fast. Independents' views are similar to the national average. Although Trump has signed more executive action this year than he did in his first 100 days of his first term, Americans were more inclined in 2017 than they are now to say he was moving too fast. Gallup asked the question about just one other president's pace, Obama, in 2009. At that time, a majority of Americans, 63%, said it was about right. The rest were more likely to say Obama was acting too fast, 22%. And yet the too fast just filled the room, filled the vacuum in the room. Because again, the Fox News folks, talk radio folks, GOP politicians were screaming like scalded dogs about Obama's executive overreach. Here's the bottom line, according to Gallup. Most presidents have experienced a honeymoon period with strong job approval ratings in the initial months after of their presidencies that then fade as time passes. Trump did not enjoy such a traditional honeymoon period in his first term, as the 45% of Americans who expressed approval of him in the initial reading in 2017 was not much higher than his 41% term average. Initial approval ratings for all elected presidents since Eisenhower, not including Trump, averaged 61%. Trump is starting his second term just like the first, with Americans evenly divided over how well he is doing his job. Slightly more now have an opinion one way or the other, but his current 47% approval rating is still lower than initial readings for all other modern presidents aside from his first rating in 2017. Trump's fellow Republicans overwhelmingly approve of the job he is doing so far and think his speed in addressing major problems in the U.S. has been about right. His support from Republicans and independents is slightly higher than what it was in 2017, while Democrats' support is even lower. While there's no single way to define a presidential honeymoon, Gallup writes, Trump's approval ratings in the coming months will test one common standard. If his ratings go down for a sustained period, his initial ratings will look elevated by comparison. You know, the honeymoon period, as sad as that honeymoon looks. Presidential honeymoons are often defined retrospectively in this way. What do we glean from this? Those of us left of center who are thinking, what's going to happen in the midterms? What's going to happen in 2028? You know, I hear a lot of doom and gloom from folks on the left. There's no way the 2026 and 2028 elections will be fair because he will be firmly entrenched and will, have, infected at the state level. Elections are all handled at the state level, I mean, here in the state of Georgia, we've seen a lot of attempts anyway to inject the MAGA ideology and agenda into the state election board and how they handle things. Even in a blue state like, or I say blue state, even in a red state like Georgia, you have a Secretary of State who famously took a phone call where he was being manipulated to find 11,780 votes, and he did not cave. Now listen, I have a lot of criticism for the Secretary of State's office here in the state of Georgia, dating back to Kemp being the Secretary of State. I think our state election system is something of a mess. You've heard this show talk a lot with Marilyn Marks for the Coalition for Good Governance about many of the befuddling actions taken by both the State Election Board and the Secretary of State's office overseeing states' elections. But if there's one thing that I do feel confident about, relatively confident, I put it at 85-90%. I don't think the staff of the Secretary of State's office, Brad Raffensperger, Gabriel Sterling, et al., or even Governor Brian Kemp to this point, are the type that can be influenced to do anything outside of GOP norms anyway. I mean, gerrymandering. They love gerrymandering, and they love to make it hard for folks to vote, but to outright change results, not seeing that. Although, there is a particularly peculiar case in Sumter County where a lot of cartoon characters wound up voting for, I think it was like a school board seat. Marilyn has been actually messaging me about this for quite a while, and she is prepping that story, and we'll have that for us at some point in time. And I'll have her on, and we'll go into that at great lengths. But it was caught, and while the Secretary of State's office has some questions to answer about that, and trust me, we'll do our best to hold them accountable here, I do have relative confidence anyway that while there may be some attempts to affect midterm outcomes from the White House, that there are, first of all, enough blue states and enough states with some renegade Republicans at the helm, Georgia being, feel relatively confident, one of them anyway, that will at least hold the line. And that's what Democrats have to look forward to. They have to look forward to 2026 and winning back the House and making some gains in the Senate to hold this administration accountable. That is going to do it for today's Ron Show and this week's show notes, as always, at RonShowATL.com. We replay 5 p.m. on America One Radio, 11 p.m. Progressive Voices via TuneIn. Enjoy your weekend. I'll try and do the same. We'll see you here Monday. Take care.